Evening. Red Valley lay under a kind of cold wind that felt like the land itself was letting out a long breath. Snowflakes the size of a thumbnail fell, gathering into a thick white layer across the ground, covering every footprint, every familiar sound of the town. At the small station at the end of the trail, a weak yellow lamp cast light on the shadow of a man standing alone beneath the old shelter. Calder Wright pulled his collar up, but the wind still cut through the thin fabric like a cold blade. He was 45, though from a distance he looked older. His cheeks were hollow after months of poor meals, his eyes deep from long sleepless nights, and his stance carried a slight bend, as if a weight he never set down had shaped his spine. In the left pocket of his coat was Isaiah's paper scrap, childlike lines, two figures drawn close together, the words "me and Pa" beneath. Calder did not need to look. He knew every hard charcoal stroke. Day after day, it kept him alive. The scheduled train was nearly 40 minutes late. The wind roared past the empty cars, sounding like a call no one would answer. Calder expected nothing from that train, as he expected nothing from tomorrow. But it was the only place with light tonight. So he stood there, waiting the way a man waits when he has nowhere else to go. Just as he thought he should return to the torn tent on the edge of town, a figure emerged through the curtain of snow. At first, only a blur, like a drifting shape moving where the wind pushed it. Then closer, a woman. A dark, long dress, but no coat, no scarf, no gloves. Her soft curls, likely tied when she left wherever she came from, had loosened in the wind, strands clinging wet against her cheeks. Mara Ellison walked slowly, tired, her steps sliding on the icy ground. She tried to shield herself with her arms pressed tight across her chest, but the cold pierced through, shaking her shoulders with each breath. Everything about what she wore showed one thing clearly. She was not made for this kind of weather. A sudden gust struck the station. Mara faltered, nearly losing the small bag in her hand. Instinct made Calder step forward. He caught her arm lightly before she fell. The touch lasted only a moment, but it stopped them both. Mara looked up. Her eyes, dark and deep as a night river, met Calder's gray, tired gaze. In that brief second, he saw something that matched the weight inside him, fear of having to face the world alone. Calder drew his hand back. "You all right, ma'am?" Mara gave a small nod, but her lips were blue, and no words came. Her hands trembled so hard she could barely hold her bag. Calder studied her for a quiet moment. No one came to the station on a storm night, except those desperate or out of choices. But what kept his eyes on her was not any trace of refinement. It was the way she tried to stand straight, holding on to a thin edge of dignity in a storm that could tear the sky apart. Without thinking, further, Calder slipped off his only coat. The lining was worn, the collar torn since last winter, but it had kept him alive until now. He placed it over her shoulders. Mara startled, stepping back. "No, I can't." "You're freezing," Calder said, his voice rough like wind passing an old door. "I've been colder than this." A harmless lie. "I'm Calder Wright, north of Red Valley. Keep the coat. Don't worry about it." A plain Calder sentence, short, honest, meant only so she would not feel burdened. She hesitated. Then her hands slowly pulled the coat closed. The faint warmth trapped in the sheep lining touched her skin, and her eyes shut for a moment. When she opened them, something had changed. Gratitude, confusion, and the quiet surprise of someone not used to receiving kindness without a price. The headlamp of the train cut through the snow from afar. Mara turned toward the light, as someone looking for a road back. She spoke softly, enough for him alone to hear. "Mara Ellison, thank you for this." She stepped onto the train. Calder stayed still, lifting a hand only to set the collar straight on her shoulders one last time. The door shut. The train's light blended into the storm, then drifted away until even its glow was gone. Calder turned, pressing his bare arms tight to his chest. The cold bit like needles. But somewhere deep inside, someplace he thought long dead, a small spark lit. A storm night, an old coat, and a lost woman. None of it felt like much. Yet together, it formed a moment that shifted something in him before he even understood it. He only knew one thing. For the first time in months, shaped by loss, he did not feel entirely alone. And the night wind, though still sharp as broken ice, eased its cruelty by a shade. The warmth inside the train car made Mara Ellison feel lightheaded. The carriage was closed in, the oil lamp flickering against the window fogged by breath. Snow still fell outside, but in here, everything was still. She settled into the velvet seat, her hands tightening the coat the stranger had placed on her shoulders. The blend of old leather and wood smoke mixed with the cold scent still clinging from the night wind, catching in her throat. The coat was too large, almost covering her whole frame. She ran her fingers along the frayed seam of the collar, then brushed against something inside the inner pocket. A sheet of paper folded in quarters. She drew it out, opening it gently, as if it might fall apart. Inside was a charcoal sketch. 2 stick figures standing together beneath a tilted sun. A scrawled line underneath read, "Me and Pa. I miss you. Your son, Isaiah." Mara froze. Her breath slipped out in a thin, sharp sound. The clumsy, earnest letters felt like they traced the same emptiness inside her. She pressed the paper to her chest, as if her heart tightened and warmed all at once. She did not know the man. She did not know how he lived, or if anyone waited for him at home. Yet with one simple act, giving away his only coat, he had stirred something she thought long buried. The train swayed as it turned along the bend. Light slid over her face, then vanished. In that brief shadow, memory rose, so vivid she could hear it again. Kansas City, 13 years old. A winter night thick as ash. She had run from the foster house, fleeing beatings and cruel words. She had nothing but a worn dress and bare feet on the snow. She thought she would die on that church step, curled against the iron-cold stone. Then a man's voice, rough and low, rose from above her, steady and warm. "Don't sleep, girl. Lose your heat, and you lose your chance." She looked up. An old man with gray beard, hands shaking with age, pulled off his heavy leather coat and wrapped it around her. That warmth did more than save her body from the cold. It preserved a small, fragile belief that the world, harsh as it was, still held places where kindness lived. At dawn, he took her to an orphanage and left. She never saw him again. She remembered only the smell of dark tobacco and the coarse hide of that coat. 20 years later, she kept that memory, not for gratitude, but as a warning never to be weak. She had climbed her way up, from a junior clerk in a railway office to co-chair of the Western Continental Railroad, the first black woman to hold power in the largest transport line in the Western Territories. On paper, she was one of the most powerful people in Wyoming. The state bent beneath her signature. Yet deep within, there remained a hollow nothing could fill. One power and money only sharpened. Mara looked again at the paper in her hands. The black strokes had smudged with the sweat of a father. She imagined the child, Isaiah, likely his name, and the man who had stripped off his coat in the storm. He was poor, that was clear, but his eyes, they did not belong to a man beaten down. They were the eyes of someone who still knew how to care. She touched the words, "I miss you," and something unfamiliar moved inside her, quiet but heavy. She whispered, almost to herself, "A man like you shouldn't vanish in the snow." Light from the end of the car traced her damp curls, giving a thin outline to her face. Outside, the train cut through snow-covered pines, leaving a trail of white smoke spinning into the wind. She clutched the coat. Its warmth had seeped into her skin like a reminder. Far east, the Western Continental was opening a new rail branch, a contract people called Mara Ellison's greatest win. But she thought nothing of profits or reports. She thought only of Calder Wright, a man who had lost nearly everything and still held on to what was decent. That night, as the train left Red Valley behind, Mara closed her eyes and made herself a promise. She would find him, not to repay a debt, but to remind him the world still had room for men like him. Because sometimes, a small kindness offered in a snowstorm is what keeps a life from freezing over. Morning at the logging camp north of Red Valley began with a cold sharp enough to crack skin. The thud of axes striking pine echoed in steady rhythm, each swing as heavy as the heartbeat of men who survived by muscle more than luck. Calder Wright stood in the yard, thin coat, hands wrapped in torn cloth, his face covered with a fine layer of sawdust like mist. He worked in silence, speaking to no one. The others knew only that he had arrived months ago, slept little, smiled less, and worked twice as hard as any of them. During the break, he sat on a rotting stump near the makeshift fire pit. The heat rose weakly, not nearly enough to chase off the cold. Calder reached into his coat for the half-finished biscuit, then stopped. He remembered. There had been something else in that pocket that day. The paper, Isaiah's drawing. It struck him like the edge of an axe. He lifted a hand to his forehead, breathing out slowly. The only thing he had carried through so many winters, the one thing that kept him upright, now lay somewhere else, in the coat he had given to a stranger in a snowstorm. He knew he had done right by helping her, but the memory of that paper weighed on him like stone. He still recalled every charcoal line, every crooked loop around the sun, the uneven words, "Me and Pa, I miss you." Losing it felt like losing the last thread tying him to his small son. Wind rose, carrying the scent of pine resin and new snow. Calder rubbed his eyes, stood, gripped the axe and tried to drive every regret into each swing. But the more he worked, the emptier he felt. Elsewhere, in the oak-paneled offices of the Western Continental Railroad, Mara Ellison set her coffee cup down. Its warmth did nothing to settle the hollow inside her. For 2 days, she had thought of the man's face, the quiet gray eyes, the cracked hands that had been gentle when offering her his coat, and the small paper in that pocket. It had kept her awake. She looked up as Thaddeus, her longtime assistant, stepped in. "You called for me?" Mara nodded. "I need you to find someone. In Red Valley." Thaddeus frowned. "A name." "Calder Wright. I know nothing else, only that I owe him." Her eyes made Thaddeus fall silent. He understood. Some debts had nothing to do with money. 3 days later, the snow stopped. At the logging camp, Calder was loading the last pieces of timber onto the wagon when he heard hooves stop nearby. A man stepped down, black overcoat, polished boots, tidy scarf. He looked around, then called out, "Excuse me, is there a Calder right here?" Calder looked up. His name, rarely spoken, sounded like a voice from another world. He set the log aside and wiped his hands on his trousers. "That's me," he said, voice rough. The stranger smiled, stepped closer, and held out a hand. "Thaddeus Moore, assistant to Miss Mara Ellison, Western Continental Railroad. She sent me to find you." Calder glanced at the clean, well-trimmed hand, then at his own, calloused, cracked, sticky with resin. He hesitated. At last he took the handshake. It was brief, stiff, unfamiliar. Two worlds meeting through a pane of frosted glass. "She wants to see me?" Calder asked, frowning lightly. "Yes. She said she only wished to thank you." Calder gave a faint, hollow laugh. "Thank me." He started to turn away, but Thaddeus continued, calm and steady. "She's at the Copper Lantern Hotel. If you could spare a moment, she would be grateful. The carriage is ready." Calder stood still for a long breath. Part of him wanted to refuse. A woman like her, she had surely forgotten him once the train pulled away. But the memory of the paper stirred. If he met her again, perhaps he could retrieve it. "Give me a few minutes," he said quietly. He washed his hands in the cold stream, smoothed his hair, and straightened the least worn shirt he owned. When he returned, Thaddeus nodded and opened the carriage door. The road from the camp to town stretched across fields of snow, the afternoon sun slanting low, gold spilling through the window. Calder sat upright, hands on his knees, gaze fixed outside. The carriage stopped before the Copper Lantern Hotel, the finest in Red Valley. Inside the lobby, Calder halted. High ceiling, bright chandeliers, carpet soft underfoot made him step lighter without meaning to. The attendant bowed, surprised by his rough clothes. Thaddeus led him up to the second floor, stopping before a large door. He knocked lightly. "Miss Ellison, Mr. Wright has arrived." Calder drew a long breath and fixed his collar. In the hallway mirror, he caught sight of a man he barely recognized, lost, stiff, yet with something in his eyes that looked alive again, a mix of hesitation and hope. The door opened. Warm light spilled out, rising across his tired face. Calder Wright, a man who believed he had nothing left to lose, stepped into the room where fate was waiting. The sitting room of the Copper Lantern Hotel was warmed by a glowing coal stove, yet Calder Wright still felt cold. Not the cold of the storm outside, but the kind that rose from being out of place. A man used to silence and sawdust suddenly pulled into a world polished with velvet and glass. Mara Ellison stood by the window, the light from outside tracing a warm bronze edge along her shoulders. When Thaddeus left, she turned, holding a sheet of paper. "This belongs to you," she said. Calder recognized it at once. Isaiah's drawing. He reached out, touching it lightly, his fingers trembling as if it were something sacred. The smudged charcoal lines, the child's uneven words were still there. "Me and Pa. I miss you. Your son, Isaiah." His throat tightened. "I thought it was gone," he murmured, almost to himself. Mara watched him for a long moment. Something in the man's face made her chest pull tight. A raw honesty she had never seen in the rooms filled with powerful people she spent her life navigating. "I can't forget that night," she began. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask a single thing. You just took off your coat and walked away, in a cold that could stop a heart. You chose kindness. Calder said nothing, eyes fixed on the drawing. I only did what had to be done, ma'am. That's all. No hero in it. But you reminded me of who I used to be. Her voice lowered, then steadied again. I didn't come only to return the paper, Calder. I want to help you. He lifted his head, gray eyes flickering with doubt. Help me? Yes. I have a new position at Western Continental. Steady work, good pay, a home of your own. If you take it, I can help you regain custody of Isaiah. She spoke calmly, but her eyes softened. Calder froze. The words good pay and a home sounded like things from another life. Yet at the same time, heat rose to his face. You think I need your charity? His voice rasped, low and sharp. Mara stopped short. No, You don't know me, he cut in. Don't know what I've lost, what I've fought for. You see some ragged man in the snow and decide you can pull him out of his own life? There was anger in him, mixed with shame. He hated being looked at as someone pitiful, hated even more knowing she wasn't wrong, that he had nothing left but a worn-down pride. Mara stepped forward, her voice gentler. Calder, I'm not pitying you. I just owe you something money can't cover. He let out a dry, hollow laugh. A woman like you owes nothing to anyone. The space between them narrowed to a few steps. She meant to speak again, but Calder turned away, hands clenched tight enough to whiten his knuckles. The room thickened with silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, tapping lightly against the window. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice lower. I've worked for people like you before. Folks who remember me only when a fence breaks or a post needs setting. No one remembers my name. I don't need favors. Mara stayed quiet. She saw the wound tightening around him, the humiliation of a man who once had something, lost it all, and now held only a thin strand of pride. She started to turn, but at that moment, Calder noticed her scarf slipping loose. Without thinking, he lifted a hand and pulled the collar of her coat higher around her shoulders. A simple, awkward gesture, yet strangely intimate. Mara didn't move. The warmth of his hand brushed her skin, and she shivered. Their eyes met at a distance close enough for her to hear his breath, and for him to see the faint tremor of her lashes. Neither spoke in that moment. Then Mara drew a deep breath, stepped back half a pace and said, steady and low, Calder, give me 1 hour. Just one. I'll show you what I mean. This isn't pity. It's trust. He looked at her, conflict tightening in his gaze. Trust a wealthy woman who had once found him in the snow, or hold on to the worn pride he had left. At last, he nodded. 1 hour, he said, voice rough. But don't make me regret it. I won't, Mara answered quietly. You'll understand. She turned, her skirt brushing lightly against his knee, leaving behind a faint scent of sandalwood and melting snow. Calder stood still, feeling a strange mix of discomfort and something else, something unfamiliar, like stepping into a storm without wind, lit only by the eyes of a woman who seemed able to see through the stones he had stacked around his heart for years. The carriage rolled out of town, its wheels grinding over a thin sheet of ice with a brittle sound. Calder sat inside, silent, hands resting on his knees. He did not know where they were headed, only that the woman across from him was looking out the window, her face calm but her eyes holding something he could not name. They passed rows of wooden houses, crossed a frozen river, until the landscape opened into a stretch of land along a hillside. A two-story house came into view, painted white, with a long porch and a thin blue plume rising from the chimney. A sign at the gate read, "Frontier Hope House." "What place is this?" Calder asked, his voice low. "My house," Mara replied, then gave a small smile. "But not entirely. It belongs to people who once had nothing left." As they stepped inside, the sound of children filled the rooms. A little girl, about 6, ran over and wrapped her arms around Mara's skirt. "Miss Mara's back!" "Yes, I'm back, Sarah," Mara said, bending to smooth the girl's hair. "And I brought ginger candies for you all." At once, more children rushed in, laughter lifting through the house. Calder stepped back a little, uncertain. He was not used to noise, and even less used to wide, curious eyes studying him. A small girl with braided pigtails tugged on Mara's hand and pointed at him. "Is he freezing, miss?" The room burst into giggles. Calder managed a rare smile, the first in months. He nodded at the child and said quietly, "Maybe I am, little one." By the stove, an older woman was pulling bread from the oven. Mara introduced her. "This is Mrs. Hayes. She runs this place when I'm away." Mrs. Hayes nodded kindly. "Miss Mara speaks highly of you. Sit down. I'll pour some tea." Calder thanked her awkwardly, then let Mara lead him through the house. The walls were covered with children's drawings, fields, houses with smoke curling upward, stick figures holding hands. One drawing, scribbled in shaky pencil, had a single word beneath it. "Home." "They're orphans?" he asked. "Most of them," Mara said. "Some were abandoned. Some came with mothers who had nowhere left to go. Here, they have meals, warm beds, and someone who calls their name each morning." Calder stayed silent. Everywhere he looked, he saw traces of Mara, curtains patched with white thread, rough-hewn frames, small things without luxury, but filled with the touch of someone who knew loss. They sat on a long bench by the window. Afternoon light slanted in, catching Mara's hair and turning it the color of burnished thread. "I used to be one of these children," she said, her voice slow. "No parents, moving from place to place. When I was 12, I ran from the last home and almost froze to death on a church step in Kansas City." Calder looked at her, breath caught. "That night," Mara continued, "an old man found me. He had only one heavy coat, and he gave it to me. Then he stayed beside me till morning. He said, 'The world is cold enough, child. Don't let your heart grow colder.'" She gave a faint smile. "I never forgot." Calder lowered his gaze. The simple story carried the weight of a stone placed on his chest. "Frontier Hope House exists because of that night," Mara said. "I told myself that if I survived, I would give someone else the thing I was given, a chance to begin again." They sat in quiet for a moment. Children's laughter drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the smell of fresh bread. Calder realized his hands had unclenched. "Now you see why I brought you here?" she asked softly. He nodded, his voice deeper, warmer than before. "You weren't trying to save me. You were sharing what you believe." Mara smiled. "That's right." He looked at her longer this time, seeing someone different. Not the powerful woman who stepped off golden trains, but a soul once frozen to the bone, now using the warmth she had regained to warm others. A child ran past and tugged on his sleeve. "Stay for supper with us, won't you?" Calder bent down, laughing softly. "If Miss Mara allows it." She looked at him, her eyes gentle and deep as a spring. "I allow it," Evening settled. In the glow of the setting sun filtering through the window, the man who believed he had nothing left sat in a house filled with laughter, and felt his heart, after years of cold, begin to warm again. The night storm came without warning, like the breath of Wyoming itself, fierce, cold, and sudden. Wind slammed against the windows of the Copper Lantern Hotel, making the wooden frame tremble. Everything fell into darkness when the power cut, leaving only the faint glow of an oil lamp near the hearth casting a thin wash of yellow. Mara Ellison and Calder Wright sat in silence inside the empty room. The wind outside shrieked like voices calling across the valley. Mara pulled the scarf on her shoulders tighter, but still shivered. Calder noticed, stood, and took an extra wool blanket from the sofa. "You'll catch a chill," he said, his voice rough in the dim light. She meant to protest, but when he leaned down and drew the blanket around her, the rough tips of his fingers brushed the skin at her neck. The touch, small as breath, made both of them pause. Mara looked up. Their eyes met, close enough for her to see the faint scar along his jaw, close enough for him to hear the steady beat of her heart in the quiet. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling, whether from cold or something else she could not tell. Calder sat near her again. Firelight reflected in his eyes, giving them a warmth she had not seen before. After a moment, she asked, "Do you ever think, after all these years, you'd feel at ease anywhere again?" He waited, then answered, "No. I thought my heart died. When I buried my wife, I thought it stayed under the ground with her. But maybe—" He paused, staring at his cracked hands. "Maybe it just slept too long." Mara watched him, her eyes slowly filling. "I know that feeling." He turned. "You lost someone too?" She nodded, slow. "Not a person. Myself. For years I only worked, signing contracts, buying land, expanding rail lines. I thought that was living. But really, I was running from the girl who shook on that church step that night." Silence filled the room. The fire crackled, tiny sparks rising and fading in the draft. Calder looked at her as if seeing his own reflection. Two souls once frozen to the bone, now sitting beside the same fragile warmth. He spoke quietly, almost a whisper. "Maybe we're both just trying to find someone who can remind us we're still alive." Mara turned toward him. The space between them narrowed until it was only breath. She placed her hand on his. His hand was thick, weathered, rough, but warm. Calder didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his palm up and let his thumb brush lightly along her wrist. The gentleness of it tightened something in Mara's chest. Outside, thunder drifted farther away. Wind softened. Only snow kept falling, heavy and steady across the roof. In the oil lamp's small glow, the world seemed to shrink to only two people, two breaths, two heartbeats settling into the same rhythm. Mara leaned slightly closer, her hair brushing his shoulder. "Calder." She said his name like a prayer. He looked at her. This time, he didn't look away. Nothing to hide, no distance left to guard. He reached up and touched her cheek, his rough fingertip gliding down her skin, resting at her jaw. She didn't speak. She only turned her face slightly, letting him feel her warmth. For that moment, the world fell silent. Then he lowered his head, his mouth meeting hers in a kiss quiet as falling snow, slow, careful, but weighted with meaning. Not a kiss of hunger, but of two people who had been too long without gentleness. Mara answered it, her hand sliding behind his back, gripping the coarse fabric of his shirt, drawing him closer. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her with care, as though a stronger breath might make her vanish. All night, the storm continued outside, but the fire inside the small room stayed steady. They did not rush, did not speak. They let silence tell what had been lost, and in that fragile warmth, two people who believed they had broken found another way to exist. Not through tears, but through a touch soft enough to make their hearts breathe again for the first time in years. Spring returned to Wyoming like a slow kind of miracle. Snow melted, revealing red dirt roads streaked with water and thin blades of grass pushing up through mud. It was also when Calder Wright began his new work, a job he had never imagined he could do. He no longer carried logs or felled trees. Now, each morning, he wore the clean coat Mara had given him, slung a small leather satchel with a notebook inside, and walked the rail lines, stopping at work camps, rest points, and small groups of laborers no one used to bother asking about. At first, they eyed him with caution. "Another company man?" someone muttered, half mocking. But Calder only smiled, sat beside their fire, and extended his hand as an equal. "I just want to hear your stories," he said. "Then see if there's something I can help with." Slowly, their guard dropped. He listened to the man injured but denied rest. The group docked rations because of a foreman's mistake. The immigrants pushed aside. He wrote little, stored most of it in his mind, then quietly set things in motion. Letters to the office, requests to doctors, medicines delivered with Mara's messages to places she couldn't reach. One morning at the northern camp, he found two crews, Irish and Chinese, locked in a heated dispute. Tension had simmered for days over job assignments. Before the fight broke, Calder stepped between them. "That's enough," he said, his voice not loud but steady. "None of us deserve to be treated like we're beneath anyone. We're building the same road, and the wind on it won't tell us apart." Silence settled. Someone nodded. Then another. Soon, without another word, picks struck earth again, steady, blending with the distant hum of a passing train. That evening, Calder wrote a letter to Mara, describing the incident in brief. At the end, he added, "Sometimes I think this job is nothing much, but maybe lighting a few small candles is enough to push back the dark around us." Mara received the letter at the main office in Red Valley. She read it slowly, her lips tightening, then set it down. Midday light streamed through the window, striking the uneven but careful handwriting, writing of a man used to tools, not ink, but honest in every line. Thaddeus entered with more reports. "Weekly documents, Miss Ellison." "Leave them," Mara said, her voice soft but distant. She picked up the letter again, reading the last sentence once more. A small smile appeared, one that did not belong to the cold railroad chairwoman, but to a woman realizing her heart was moving again. The next day, she went to inspect the work sites, officially to review progress. But truthfully, she wanted to see the man himself. She found Calder at the Riverbend stop, working with young laborers on the rails. He knelt beside the steel line, tapping the ground, showing them how to correct the curve. When he looked up, sunlight caught the dark strands of hair damp with sweat. He spoke, little, yet every word seemed to hold weight. Mara watched from a distance, her chest tightening. There was something in the way he moved that told her what strength truly meant. Not power, but the choice to stand again and do right after being broken. When he saw her, surprise flickered across his face. He removed his hat and walked over. You didn't send word. Just passing by, she said lightly. I brought papers you need to sign. She opened her bag and handed him the stack. As he reached for it, her hand brushed the back of his. A small moment, yet enough for them both to pause. Wind passed through, carrying the scent of young grass and the echo of a far-off train. Mara withdrew her hand, but her gaze stayed, no longer the look of a superior, but of someone who had found warmth she barely dared trust. Calder lowered his head, his mouth tight. Thank you for this chance. Don't thank me, Mara replied. I only lit the fire. You're the one keeping it alive. He didn't speak, only nodded and returned to his work as she walked away. But before leaving the site, she glanced back. Calder was bending to help a young worker lift a rail beam, a brief smile touching the face that had once known only loss. Mara watched, her heart quieting. In a world ruled by machinery and profit, she had just witnessed something rare. A man who built no empire, but lit it with small candles, bright enough to show a whole stretch of land its own humanity. The day Calder held the paper granting him custody, Red Valley shone in a way it hadn't for months. Morning light fell over the church roof where he had knelt 4 months earlier, when he had nothing left but a quiet promise. Pa will come back. Now, that promise had taken shape. He walked down the aisle, hat gripped tightly in his hand. The scent of oak and candle wax pulled him back to winter nights, when he sat there, head bowed, hoping for one more glimpse of his son. Reverend Matthews waited, gentle smile, warm eyes. You kept your word, Calder, the Reverend said. Calder nodded, unable to hide the emotion. I have steady work now, a home, and I want to bring my boy back. The door opened. A small figure rushed out from the side room. Isaiah, in a white shirt, face bright as sunrise. Pa! The call tore through every mile of distance. Calder dropped to his knees, arms open. The boy ran into him, clutching his neck, laughter tangled with small sobs. Calder held him tight, feeling that small warmth stitched together pieces he thought broken beyond repair. You're taller, he said hoarsely, and stronger. I knew Pa would come back, Isaiah replied, brown eyes shining. Calder smiled through tears. Pa barely believed himself, but Pa believed you. At the door, Mara watched quietly. She had arrived early, wanting to witness the moment for herself. As Isaiah clung to his father, something tightened in her chest, a strange mix of joy and a soft ache. Her hand rose to her coat, over the place where her heartbeat had shifted. That evening, Mara accepted their invitation to supper at the new home, a small wooden house at the edge of town, roof slanted toward the open field. Sunset brushed the kitchen window, turning the room a pale gold. Calder moved around the stove with a kind of shy awkwardness, stirring a pot of soup, while Isaiah eagerly set the table, chattering nonstop. Pa, you think Miss Mara likes cornbread? She'll eat anything if you don't spill the pot, Calder said, smiling, rare, unguarded. The meal was simple, vegetable soup, toasted bread, a few potatoes, but in that small house, it tasted better than any banquet Mara had attended. Isaiah talked without pause, telling stories of church, of new friends, then suddenly turned to Mara. Miss Mara, you helped Pa get his new job, right? Mara smiled. Your Pa helped himself, Isaiah. I just stood nearby. The boy nodded solemnly, as if he understood, then yawned. His eyes grew heavy, and within minutes, he was curled on the sofa, asleep in the hush of the evening wind. Calder pulled a blanket over him, his hand lingering on the boy's hair. When he turned, he caught Mara watching him, the look in her eyes soft and deep like firelight behind glass. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." "Don't thank me," she whispered. "I'm only doing what you taught me. When someone's lost in the cold, you don't leave them there." He stepped closer. Only the space of a breath separated them. The fire cracked softly, its light shifting across their faces. Neither spoke. Mara gave a small smile, carrying more than simple happiness. There was fear in it, and hope. Calder looked at her, something in his eyes trying to speak what words couldn't. She gave a slight nod, a gesture small but clear as an unspoken vow. When she stepped onto the porch, the first snow of the season fell over her hair, and Calder stood framed in the doorway, watching until she disappeared into the night. He lowered his gaze to his son sleeping on the chair, his heart filling with a peace he never expected to feel again. For the first time in years, in the small house of a man who once had nothing left, two things returned together: the laughter of a child and the warm light of a woman's heart. That summer, the Wyoming wind carried the smell of oil and hot iron. The railway stretched across the plains, the clang of hammers and anvils blending with the breath of hundreds of men building a new world. Among them, Calder Wright moved from camp to camp, not with the bearing of a supervisor, but like a quiet older brother. He carried no authority, only a pair of listening ears and a heart once broken, something that earned trust more than any title. At a camp near Silver Creek, tension between two crews, Irish and Chinese, had simmered for weeks. Harsh words, a few small fights, and resentment had taken root. When Calder arrived, the air felt ready to burst. He didn't shout, didn't command. He simply picked up a hammer, set it down between the two groups, and spoke, his voice low but steady. "This rail won't go anywhere if we're fighting. It'll stay right here, cold and useless, same as a man's heart when it's full of hate." A young worker yelled, "He doesn't understand. They look down on us." Calder stepped closer, meeting his eyes. "I understand more than you think. I lost everything once because I let anger lead me." He paused, looking around before he continued. "People can starve us, break us, push us down, but only we can make our hearts small." It wasn't philosophy. It was truth hammered out from nights he had collapsed under cold and loneliness. Slowly, the tension eased. One man set his hammer down, then another. By the time someone called, "Back to work," a few were already smiling. That evening, Calder sat by the fire listening to young workers sing. A man beside him, named Eamon, lowered his head, voice tight. "I almost walked away last week. Lost my wife back home. I didn't see a reason to keep going." Calder was quiet, then spoke slowly. "I thought the same once. There were nights I wanted to disappear. But then I thought of my boy, thought of the people who might need me, even a little. And I learned this: the world only truly goes dark when we let go." Eamon looked at him, tears falling. Calder set a hand on his shoulder and said the words that workers later repeated, like a lantern flame along the entire line. "The world dims when we leave it, but brightens when we stay and light one more candle." The sentence spread faster than he imagined. Workers repeated it at other stations, carved it into toolboxes, wrote it on walls, even stitched it into cloth. At the central office, Mara received reports about Calder nearly every week. He settled the dispute. He got an injured man treated. He made the whole crew sing after supper. Once Thaddeus read aloud a letter from a foreman. If we had 10 more like Wright, this whole region would feel half as cold. Mara set the page down, smiling faintly. In the late light filtering through the glass, she looked out toward the endless rails, her heart rising with a quiet pride. That man, the one who once, crouched alone in a snowstorm, shaking from loss, was now doing what she had only dreamed of, building a world with a soul. Another afternoon, she visited Riverbend unannounced. Calder was helping a few young workers reset an anchor stake. She watched from a distance, seeing him bend, guide their hands, patient and sure. A child rushed past, shouting, "When Mr. Wright shows up, everyone cheers!" She smiled, not stepping closer. She only watched the sun catch on his coat, on the rough, steady lines of him, and a quiet thought moved through her. Not everyone needs saving. Some are born to remind the rest of us how to make the world less cold, just by believing in what's good. Across the Western Continental Line, workers began calling him by a new name, passing it from camp to camp. The railman with the candle. The railman who carried a small flame. The man who made the darkness retreat, 1 inch at a time. The ceremony took place in the grand hall of the Western Continental Central Station, decorated with lanterns, flowers, and bright bronze ribbons. People from all over came, workers, foremen, townsfolk, even children from Frontier Hope House, filling the room with light. On the banner above, the words stood clear, "A legacy of warmth." Mara Ellison stood on the wooden platform, her voice carrying through the quiet space. "A year ago, I was saved not only from a snowstorm, but from the cold settling inside my own heart. A man with nothing but kindness gave me the only coat he had, and with that act reminded me of the true meaning of humanity." Below, Calder Wright sat in the front row. His eyes were lowered, hands resting on his knees, fingers tightening and loosening. He wasn't used to crowds, nor to hearing his name echo in applause. Mara continued, "Today, I want us all to remember this. The smallest act, a kind gesture, a gentle word, an old coat, can change not just one life, but an entire world." She signaled, and 2 assistants pulled the cloth from the display at center stage. Light struck the glass case, revealing the old leather coat, patched, worn, the stitches frayed. Beneath it, a brass plaque read, "One act of kindness can change the direction of a life." A wave of applause erupted. Calder lifted his head, the stage lights gleaming over the coat that had once felt like a second skin. Beneath the noise, he could hear his own heartbeat, slow, heavy, afraid. Mara turned toward him. "Calder Wright, please join me." He rose, walking up the steps. His boots tapped softly on the wood, blending with murmurs of admiration. When he reached her side, Mara turned, smiling gently, like the glow of an oil lamp on a winter night. "You taught me that kindness needs no title," she said, her voice unsteady. "You reminded us that humanity isn't something we're born with. It's something we choose to hold on to, no matter how harsh the world becomes." Calder stood still, eyes on the coat, throat tight. He didn't know what to say, ground out only a small nod. Applause rose again, but to him it felt distant. That night, when the ceremony ended, Mara found him standing alone in the empty station. The night wind drifted through, tugging at the ribbons still hanging. "You slipped out without a word," she said softly as she approached. He turned, his gaze tired. I don't..." belong here, Mara. Among people like you, I'm just a man out of place. I don't know how to stand in that kind of light. That light is yours." He gave a faint laugh, shaking his head. "No, it's yours. I just brushed against it." Mara stepped closer. "Calder, without you, I would not be standing here today. If anyone deserves a place in this world, it's you." He wanted to believe her, but fear ran too deep. Years of poverty, loss, and worn-down pride had taught him to trust only what he could touch. Wood, soil, sweat. Not things that gleamed like promises. A small hand slipped between them. "Isaiah." The boy looked up, eyes bright in the station lamps. "Pa," he said, "Miss Mara believes in you. I do too." He held Mara's hand, then guided his father's hand to meet hers. "You both make me feel warm," Isaiah said simply. Calder bent down, tears rising. He squeezed his son's hand, then looked at Mara. In that second, fear and doubt melted like breath in cold air. He knelt, pulling from his coat a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver ring with a turquoise stone. Looking up, his voice rough but steady, he said, "Will you marry me, Mara Ellison?" Mara froze, hand to her mouth, tears shining. She nodded, trembling. "Yes, Calder, 1,000 times yes." Applause burst across the hall. Isaiah wrapped his arms around them both. Outside, snow began to fall. Not the storm of that old winter night, but gentle flakes drifting down over the world where two lost souls had finally found their way home together. Their wedding was not held in a grand church or a fine hall, but in the place that had sheltered so many lost souls, Frontier Hope House. A beginning for countless children, and the place where two broken people found their way back to one another. That morning, sunlight lay thin across the white-painted roof. The wind carried the smell of baked bread and the laughter of children. The front yard was set with simple ribbon, wildflowers from the hillside, and rough wooden chairs made by the railroad workers themselves. No one called it the railroad president's wedding or the hero's ceremony. To everyone in Red Valley, it was simply the day two good people were finally allowed to be happy. Children ran about, tossing paper petals cut from old letters. The men who had worked under Calder, laborers, foremen, immigrants, stood in the back rows, shirts clean, hair combed. Mrs. Hayes stepped out from the kitchen, a handkerchief in hand, laughing and crying at once. In the center of the yard, Mara Ellison walked out in a soft cream dress, no pearls, no long veil, only a wildflower pinned in her hair. Light brushed her face, and for a moment the crowd fell still. She needed no grandeur, only the steady gaze of the man waiting at the end of the path. Calder Wright stood there, tall, unable to hide the emotion on his face. He wore a dark vest, but over it rested the old leather coat, the same one he had given her on that storming night. The patches remained, kept as they were, a witness to the road they had taken. As the violin began its quiet tune, Isaiah walked down the aisle with a small box in hand. His white shirt made him look like a small beam of light in the afternoon sun. Someone whispered, "That boy is the miracle of them both." Calder looked at his son, then at Mara coming toward him. She smiled, and in her eyes he saw everything he once believed he had lost: trust, hope, and a true home. When they stood together, Reverend Matthews spoke the brief vows. No ornate rituals, no honored guests, only wind, laughter, and the presence of those they had helped along the way. "Calder Wright," the Reverend said, "do you promise to love, to protect, and to keep your heart true to this woman? Calder met Mara's eyes. His voice came rough but steady as oak. I loved her from the night I gave her my coat, and I will love her until the Red Valley wind stops blowing. Mara smiled, tears falling. And I, she said softly, found my home in your hands. Isaiah opened the little box, the silver rings catching the evening light. When Calder slid the ring onto her hand, his fingers trembled. When she placed the ring on his, she whispered, "Now you're not cold anymore." The Reverend nodded, his voice carrying across the sunlit yard. I now declare you husband and wife. May this love be a fire that warms those who seek this place. Calder leaned down. Mara lifted her face. Their kiss met in the deep gold of sunset. Unhurried, unbroken, as steady as a fate finally accepted. Applause and cheers rose, the children's flutes joining the wind. Isaiah leapt forward, wrapping his arms around them, and in that moment the sight of them, the man in the old coat, the woman in the cream dress, the child held between, became the most complete picture Red Valley had ever known. When dusk fell, the last light glimmered on the windows of Hope House, where a photograph taken after the ceremony had been hung. Beneath it, Mara wrote a small line. From a single coat, a home was born. 10 years after the night snow fell over Red Valley, winter still returned faithfully each year, but it no longer carried the threat it once did. For many, it was simply a season of wind and hearth soot. But for Calder Wright and Mara Ellison, winter had become a reminder. Warmth can be built from the smallest things. Hope House was no longer just a little wooden cabin on the prairie. From what once had been 2 small rooms and a makeshift kitchen, Calder and Mara had built long dormitories for women with nowhere to go, for abandoned children, and for anyone who believed they had run out of chances. They called it the Haven Line, a place where anyone who came could find shelter and a small job within the railroad projects. Each morning, Calder still rose early as he always had, stepping outside with Isaiah, now 17, nearly as tall as his father. They checked the storage shed together, then stopped by the kitchen where Mara was teaching young women how to bake and keep accounts. Mrs. Hayes had grown old, but still sat by the window, watching over the children like she always had. "Ma, did the new girl sleep any better?" Isaiah asked, holding a cup of hot cocoa. Mara smiled. "Yes. Sometimes all it takes is a warm place and someone willing to listen." Isaiah nodded, gaze steady like his father's. He had called her Ma for so long no one remembered when it started. Maybe it was the day he fell off a horse and Mara held him, crying as if he were her own. Or the morning after the wedding, when he sleepily knocked on their door and said, "Pa, Ma, I'm hungry." Calder still remembered that moment. A small word, warm enough to make him believe he finally had a real family. As for Mara, her life was no longer tied to meetings or contracts. Instead, she traveled across the rail lines using the Legacy of Warmth Fund to open more Hope Houses. At each one, she hung the same photograph, a picture of the 3 of them, Calder, Mara, and Isaiah, standing in front of their first home in Red Valley. In a small glass box beside them sat Calder's old coat. The photograph became a symbol. People called it the coat that started it all, the coat that changed the fate of 3 lives and carried its warmth to hundreds more. Some told the story to their children each winter. Others painted the words on cafe signs, train cars, or station walls. Once, when Mara stopped at White Rock Station, she found a boy shivering in a thin shirt as he waited for his father to finish work. She took off her scarf and wrapped it around him, saying, "Keep this. Warmth spreads much faster than cold. The boy looked up and whispered, "Like the person in that picture at Red Valley Station?" Mara nodded, eyes stinging. "Yes, just like that." The following winter, Calder caught a mild illness and had to rest for several weeks. Isaiah tended to him while Mara sat nearby, knitting a new wool scarf. In the glow of the fire, they spoke very little. It was the silence of people who had lived through enough loss to know peace never needed to be loud. When Calder recovered, he stepped onto the porch, looking out across the snow-covered field. "Do you remember," he murmured, "how that coat was all I had? Now we have a home, and hundreds of others have found one too." Mara walked beside him and slipped her hand into his. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to walk away in a snowstorm. They stood together watching the children play in the yard, their laughter carried by the wind. Inside, the fire burned steadily, its light reflecting on the framed photograph hanging on the wall. 3 people, 1 old coat, and the home glowing behind them. Beneath the photo, Mara had engraved a line. "Sometimes the winter that almost breaks us becomes the reason we learn how to keep others warm." And if this story touched your heart, leave a comment. Tell me about the warmest act of kindness you've ever received or ever given. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so the flame of these Wild West love stories can stay bright in our hearts.